Good afternoon, everybody. It has been a long 4 years, and we'd like to remember those who aren't with us anymore. So we have our tributes to Berlekamp, Conway, Guy, Graham, and Randy. And to start that off, I'm going to hand the microphone back to Bob Hearn.
Yeah, I have this mic. Is this on? Yeah. So those of you who have been coming for a long time will notice some familiar faces that are gone, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It's been 4 years since we were here, and in that 4 years, within the space of a year, we lost Berlekamp and Conway and Guy, and then shortly after, Ron Graham and James Randi. Elwyn in particular was instrumental in the founding of G4G. All of these people have been big inspirations to all of us. I want to leave time for our speaker, so I'm not going to say too much about myself, but I was, like most of us here, inspired at a young age by the game of life in the 70s. In the 80s, I learned about the surreal numbers and combinatorial game theory, and winning ways was like a Bible to me. I met Elwyn at a conference a little over 20 years ago, and he invited me to G4G. And so this is my 20th anniversary of being here, and it was incredible to come here and also meet Conway and Guy. And it's just very strange. I'm sure most of you have the same, those of you who have been coming have the same sensation. It's, what is a G4G without their presence? And we've lost them all at once. Not to mention Ron Graham and James Randi. And we have atypically some pre-recorded talks, some people who couldn't be here but have very important memories to share. So this is going to be a kind of an unusual session. We've got some pre-recorded things, we've got some remote people, we've got some local people. But we're going to offer tributes in order for Elwyn Berlekamp, John Conway, Richard Guy, Ron Graham, and James Randi. And to kick things off, we have a recorded memories of David Eisenbud, who is the director of the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute and also former colleague of Elwyn at UC Berkeley.
The first time I met Elwyn Berlekamp, I was sitting in the kitchen at MSRI, minding my business and eating my lunch. He came and sat at a table with me. I knew who he was, and I knew that he was going to speak on games later that afternoon, but I did not expect to be challenged to be his opponent in a game at the lecture. Of course, we played dots and boxes, and of course, he beat me very handily. It was a long time after that I applied for the job of director of MSRI. He felt that he had to see that this new candidate, who was untried rather and an outsider to MSRI, was the right sort of person. So he arranged to come to my house for breakfast one day and make sure that I lived right. I got a taste that time of his conversational style, the first taste, which was one, as many of you will know, of digression after digression. He loved to talk and to tell stories. I remember one puzzle that he made, and the puzzle reflected the talkiness. It was a division problem where many of the numbers were replaced by letters and others left out, and you had to figure out what it must have been. And the answer was a repeating decimal, which in the letters that were involved spelled talk, 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 talk. If any of you has a copy of that puzzle, I'd love to have it. Unfortunately, I don't have one anymore. Games, as I say, were the stuff that really made him excited, and he looked at many aspects of life as a game. He liked to tell the story of how he was the chair at one point of the computer science department at Berkeley, and there was discontent among the faculty. He had made some proposal that was getting people stirred up, and there was a difficult faculty meeting. And after some argument about whatever the proposal was, he decided he had to take action, so he proposed a vote of no confidence against himself as chair. This got a big laugh and broke the ice, and after that, things went much better. He loved collaboration on these things, and he found several real kindred spirits along the way. One of them was Zvezdanina Stankova, whom he always called Zvez. She came to MSRI and Berkeley as a postdoc and proposed that it would be good to have a math circle organization in the US, like the one in her native Bulgaria. And MSRI began to create one with a great deal of help and encouragement from Elwyn. And he was delighted by that and by her, and often spoke in that math circle. It was a great meeting of minds. He was part of MSRI before the beginning, he liked to say. Apparently he went with the group that was forming it, Cal Moore and his singer, Xingshen Chern, to the Chancellor's office to argue for the land on which MSRI sits now, a spectacular piece of property high above the Berkeley main campus. He had many favorite aphorisms about raising money and about meeting people that I still remember. For example, he told me that I always should try to guess what the person I'm meeting would be wearing and to dress in the same style to make them feel comfortable. He also told me that when you reach an agreement with somebody on whatever it is, you should immediately change the subject. And it was too often the case that people would return to the same ground and risk the agreement that they already had. His delight in kindred spirits was really a matter of great generosity. And I remember very well how pleased he was when Aaron Siegel became his student. He felt that Aaron had carried the theory of games into a new place beyond what he had done, and that pleased him no end. Finally, Elwyn was ill, and the pulmonary fibrosis that he had seemed likely to kill him in the end, as indeed it did. But he took that seriously as a game, too. He read up on every aspect of the subject and its medicines. He went to every meeting he could. He had the most modern oxygen supplies that could be found. And he really kept getting around. He had a motorized cart and came to parties, came to events, long after somebody else would have stayed home in bed. I visited him several times in his last hospitalization, and I was with him in the afternoon on which he died, in fact, when at that time he could no longer speak. So it felt to me, unusually, to make the conversation. I wondered what to talk about and thought, well, since MSRI had been such a favorite project of his, I could give him a report on how MSRI was doing. And I did that. I had the impression that he really showed a spark of interest and pleasure in that final report. That's all I have to say today about Elwyn. He was a very dear friend, and I miss him a great deal.
Next, we have a tribute from Aaron Siegel, who is going to be joining us tomorrow, but he is currently on an airplane, so bad timing for this session, but he was kind enough to pre-record some thoughts.
Hello. I will preface these remarks by saying that if everything has gone well, I'm on a plane to Atlanta at this moment. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here today to deliver these remarks in person, but I will be around tomorrow through Sunday in case anyone wants to trade Elwyn stories or chat about anything else. Elwyn has had a tremendous influence on my life. I first encountered Winning Ways when I was 12 years old. I was fortunate to have a 6th grade math teacher who loved games and puzzles and introduced me to Winning Ways. There was a lot I didn't understand about it at the time, but I returned to it several times over the years, and by the time I entered Berkeley as a graduate student, I was already familiar with Elwyn's name and familiar with combinatorial game theory. And so when I saw he was teaching a course on combinatorial games, I enthusiastically signed up. My work in Elwyn's class dovetailed into some joint work that we did as Elwyn and Richard and John were preparing the second edition of Winning Ways. And from there, I became, as it turned out, his last PhD student. Shortly after I graduated, Elwyn invited me to Gathering for Gardner. This would have been G4G7 in 2006. Martin Gardner had been another hero of mine since childhood. I devoured his books as a kid, but I had no idea an event like this existed. It was dazzling. I was on a tight budget, but Elwyn generously invited me to all the events. I learned a lot about heptagons. I got to see Leonard Green perform card magic, and what can I say, I was hooked. That was my first G4G, but I've been to every gathering since then, except for one. Elwyn meant so many things to me that it's hard to know what to say in a brief tribute such as this. But I'll talk about one of the things that most inspired me. He was a person of seemingly limitless intellectual capacity. He had an extraordinary variety of intellectual and career pursuits, yet he chose to devote a significant fraction of his life, roughly half his career by his own estimation, to the study of game. And he loved games. His eyes would light up when he talked about them, and he passionately believed in the value of studying games. Elwyn loved to tell stories, and I want to share one of my favorite anecdotes. This was from early in his career when he was a researcher at Bell Labs. And it was around this time that Elwyn discovered the work of Richard Guy and Cedric Smith on octal games, and he realized there's a surprising application of the theory of the game of chaos to dots and boxes, which was a children's game that Elwyn had been interested in since his own childhood. And he wrote up a technical report at Bell on the application of chaos to dots and boxes. And much to his surprise, the technical report was returned to his desk, accompanied by a note asking him to explain how it, quote, pertained to the needs of the Bell system. And of course, this raised Elwyn's hackles, and in a 6-page response, he argued that studying dots and boxes contributes to an understanding of abstract graph theory, which is essential to the research program at Bell. And fortunately, the senior executives at Bell were receptive to this argument, and they enabled the work to continue, and the technical report was published. And that's a good thing, because it was this work that led to Elwyn meeting Richard, and ultimately John getting involved, and from there, the publication of Winning Ways. But the incident had a lasting impression on Elwyn, and I think it reinforced his belief in the importance of studying games. And not only that, the importance of communicating around games and educating the public about their value. And of all Elwyn's career pursuits, I think it was games he loved the most. It was games that he returned to again and again throughout his career. He'd go off and work on other things for a while, but always come back to the study of games. And thinking about it, Elwyn was a person of tremendous intellectual curiosity. And games and recreational mathematics are an expression of intellectual curiosity in its purest form. And this was the same passion that inspired Martin Gardner and that brought Elwyn and Tom and Mark together to create Gathering for Gardner, which, as much as anything, it's a gathering of the curious. After that first G4G I attended in 2006, I was talking to Elwyn, and I struggled to find the words to describe it. And Elwyn smiled, and he looked at me, and with his characteristic enthusiasm, he said simply, "It was an event." And I think it would bring him tremendous joy to know that our tradition of curiosity that he helped create has outlived him. And so I'll close by saying, let's remember Elwyn as we create another event. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Look forward to seeing Aaron tomorrow. I neglected to mention something when I began this. We have a slideshow going here with various photos, and also you might note some ambigrams. And I especially want to thank Scott Kim, who specifically for this session contributed several new ambigrams of all of the people that we are honoring. There are multiple ones for some of them. There's Richard Guy and Digits, and they are all, there's also Elwyn and Dots and Boxes. And so thank you very much to Scott for that. So next we're going to talk about John Conway. I'm wearing this shirt today in his honor. This was his favorite Escher shirt. As I understand it, he wore out 3 of these, wore them until they just dissolved, and then you couldn't get them anymore, and so he was always jealous of me when he would see me here. So I'm wearing this today in honor of John. And so first up, we have Siobhan Roberts, who is John's biographer, author of Genius at Play, and previous G4G attendee, and she has recorded some memories of John.
Hi everyone, Siobhan here. Wish I were there in Atlanta, but I'm at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, working away, though my time here is in a sense bittersweet, because this time around I can't simply go up the hill and across campus to Fine Hall and find John in his alcove, as he's situated here, and consult with him about the mathematical news of the day, which I used to so like to do. Although, of course, John is still here with us. For instance, I wandered into the Institute's math library a couple weeks ago, and while I didn't find what I was looking for, what I did find, lying horizontally belly up on a shelf, drawing attention to itself in all its glory, was the Atlas of Finite Groups by John and his 4 co-conspirators. And happening upon the Atlas reminded me of an anecdote that's worth retelling. But first, to go down memory lane briefly, here is a glamour shot of John, so to speak, in the 1980s that accompanied a profile in Discover magazine. And not so glamorous, with his tongue gymnastics, of which he was so proud. And here he is at his Princeton office. This portrait was taken by Dith Pran for an article that ran in the New York Times in 1993. And here's a caricature by the mathematician Simon J. Fraser. But to get back to the Atlas anecdote, to tell it, I'll borrow from the journalist Charles Sieff, who published a feature on Conway in 1994. Therein, Sieff recounted that during one of his reporting visits, Conway asked, or maybe more demanded, "Have I done this to you yet?" And then, as Sieff told it, to quote, "Conway grabbed my hand and held it out in front of him, palm down. Before I could react, he pulled a rubber stamp out of his pocket, and my hand suddenly was emblazoned with big red letters. John H. Conway's seal of grudging approval," it read. Within seconds, it had smeared to 3 red lines that wouldn't wash off for several days. Now, the actual seal in question is this one. It figured in one of Conway's many stories about the Atlas, because the production process worked as follows. As pages pertaining to a certain group were deemed complete and error-free, they literally received Conway's seal of grudging approval. And here it is again, reproduced in a 10th anniversary volume about the Atlas. With this notion of Conway's grudging approval in mind, I reflected over this past weekend on some mathematical news of late, which Conway might have been interested in. At the very least, I would have been curious and grateful to get his assessment, for better or worse. For instance, I think he might have enthusiastically approved of this research that proposed a universal geometry of geology. And I believe he might have appreciated this piece I recently published in the New York Times, based on the very geometrical-minded work from 2 cognitive neuroscientists. But as for some recent game of life news, it's hard to say whether he would have grudgingly approved or vehemently disapproved. Life was a bit of a mood ring for Conway, notoriously. And similarly, I think he would have been delighted by this news, that the Conway knot is not a slice. But I'm not sure he'd be so thrilled to see DeepMind moving in on knot theory and symmetry, with these results toward the end of last year, published and reported in Nature. In this case, I figure Conway's main bone of contention might have been that AI is a black box. So maybe if mathematics ultimately illuminates what's going on inside of the AI systems, and it turns out to be something elegant and simple, mathematically speaking, maybe then he'd be won over. But this type of machine really is perhaps more Conway's speed. This is his water computer, which he invented while an undergrad at Cambridge, one of my favorites. He named it Winnie, which possibly stood for Water-Initiated Nonchalantly Numerical Integrating Engine. He couldn't quite remember the exact inspiration for the name, as it were, but he did recall that in terms of the engineering, he was inspired by his own close observation of urinal flushing mechanics. And I'll leave you with another Conway machine of sorts, Fractran, another favorite, which was really more an esoteric programming language. The program, the algorithm, was nothing but a list of fractions. And at that, Fractran could compute anything that was computable. It was Turing complete. And by the way, that's many multiples of Richard Guy there, serving as divisional inspectors. So all of that's to say that there was never any shortage of fascinating fun hanging out with John. I do miss him dearly. I miss his wisdom and his curiosity. And he was so generous in letting me hang around for so many years working on the book. And indeed, as he told me after I published his biography, there's nowhere to go from here, that is post-Conway. There's nowhere to go but down. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, for that. Next, we have a remote presentation memory from Doris Schattschneider, who some of you may remember was one of our featured presenters at our last G4G, and is well known for her work on Escher, and also for popularizing the Pentagon tilings discovered by Marjorie Rice, based on reading about Pentagon tilings and Martin Gardner.
Hello, I'm Doris Schattschneider, and I want to begin by showing you what Siobhan did not, and that is her wonderful book about John Conway. She's just given you many anecdotes, and this book is chock full of them, also not just his mathematics, but also many other adventures with John. So I recommend it highly. I want to begin with some remarks by Marjorie Seneschal, who had hoped to be here but wasn't able to be here. So Marjorie wanted to talk about John's role in creating and shaping mathematical communities. These are her words. 2 years ago, as the news of John's death flew around the world, I received an email from a contributor to the Mathematical Intelligencer urging us to plan a special issue in his memory. And by the way, that special issue did happen. Here's that special issue of the Intelligencer, completely devoted to John's work and is full of both mathematics and wonderful anecdotes about his life. There are 29 different articles about John. This contributor said John was none such. None such is exactly the right word. And he was none such in many different ways. One was his keen intuition of people's feelings. I think it was that intuition that made the real difference in an NSF program in the early 90s called the Regional Geometry Institutes, or RGIs. The idea was to bridge the gulfs in the American mathematical community, the gulfs between university and college faculty on the one hand, high school teachers on the other, and college and graduate students on yet another. The bridge consisted of bringing representatives of these communities together for a month to focus on a common mathematical geometric theme. For the first 2 years, the bridges were one way. Researchers graciously telling teachers what math really is and giving them a glimpse of beauty. But in the third year, at Smith College, these three communities were truly one, thinking together, building models together, exploring their properties. The main difference was this time John Conway was there. John didn't see three communities, he saw one. The gulfs we were trying to bridge simply didn't exist for him. Together, all of us made models of Conway's famous biprism, which I have a model here. This fills space, three-dimensional space, in an aperiodic way. And John delighted in teaching about the orbifold notation for symmetry groups in 2 and 3 dimensions, and the teachers and students caught on quickly. That's Marjorie's remarks that I'd like to add to those as well, because I was also at that RGI in 1993. I was tasked with being the liaison between the high school teachers and the university teachers, the university researchers rather. I had to give them background for each researcher's lecture and host an after-lecture session in which the researchers were expected to interact with the teachers and answer their questions. Many researchers struggled with that part. They weren't used to explaining or being questioned by high school teachers. John excelled at this. In his own way, he was like a Pied Piper, always surrounded by students, teachers, and yes, researchers. So the RGI achieved its goal of bridging these diverse groups. It was memorable for all, and John was the magic ingredient. I'd like to now make some of my own remarks about John, whom I first met in 1976 at a conference on recreational mathematics, where he gave a memorable lecture about properties of the just-discovered Penrose tilings. While John is a legend in the mathematical world, having made major contributions to group theory, knot theory, number theory, coding theory, discrete geometry, and even more, we here at Gathering for Gardner know that he was just as serious about recreational mathematics. And so to honor John's memory, I want to tell you briefly about 2 geometric gems that bear his name. One is called the Conway circle, and the other, the Conway criterion. I'm going to share my screen now, and the first up is the Conway circle theorem. If we have a trial, excuse me, I need to get something. Okay. Given triangle ABC, we extend its sides through the vertex angles so that at each vertex, you extend the sides through that vertex a length equal to the opposite side. And then the circle theorem, Conway circle theorem, says the endpoints of those extended lines all lie on a circle, and that's called the Conway circle. And that's not all. The center of that circle is also the center of the incircle of triangle ABC. I'm not going to prove this for you, but there are many proofs of it, and you can find several of them on this website set up by Colin Mulcahy, and there have been several other websites that also spout various proofs of this theorem. I think it's just a gem. And the second item, the Conway criterion, as you'll see, this is a criterion that tells you about the shapes of tiles that will fill the plane in a particular way if they satisfy this criterion. So around 1975, Martin Gardner wrote an article on tiling, and he followed that with another article about pentominoes. And so everyone at that time was asking the question, how many different kinds of these polyominoes tile the plane? How many of each type? And it wasn't hard to take care of the first ones, but John was interested in the 108 different heptominoes, that is, the 7 squared figures. How many of those actually tile the plane? And this one that looks like a little horse, here's one of them. And in Gardner's article in 75, he had asked the question, what convex polygons tile the plane? And one of the types was a type 1 hexagon. Here you can see it has 2 parallel and congruent sides, and the other 4 sides are actually arbitrary. And you can see how it tiles the plane. What Conway noticed was that you could replace those straight sides, the parallel ones, by any 2 parallel and congruent segments, and replace the other straight 4 sides with what we call centrosymmetric segments. That is, segments that, if you turn them around, their midpoint land on themselves. And then he realized that you could delete some of those centrosymmetric sides. If you delete one of them, you get a pentagon tile, and that tiles. You could also delete 2 of them and get a quadrilateral tile. But you could also delete the parallel edges and get a quadrilateral tile with just 4 centrosymmetric segments, and you could even delete 1 more and just get a generalized triangle tile. All of these tile the plane, and moreover, they tile just by half turns. And so that little horse tile, the little heptamono, this is how it tiles. And there I've highlighted the 2 parallel and congruent sides, and the other edges that are separated by the vertices, the dots, are centrosymmetric. And this is the statement of the Conway criterion. To summarize it quickly, a tile can pave the plane by half turns or 180-degree rotations if you can locate 6 consecutive points around its border, call them vertices, and they then defined edges between 2 consecutive vertices. You've got one edge, called V1, V2, congruent to an opposite edge, V5, V4, by a translation that sends V1 to V5 and V2 to V4, and the other edges defined by those consecutive vertices are all centrosymmetric. That's a sufficient condition. And even something as complicated as a 30 omino, if you can recognize 2 parallel and congruent edges and up to 4 other edges connecting them, it will tile the plane, all by half turns. And during the pandemic, I was involved with 2 very clever designers of a program that allows you to make your own Conway tiles. Not only can you analyze tilings, ask the question, does this tile the plane? Is it a Conway tile? But you can also say, how can I create a Conway tile? And this one will do it for this little app, which is on the web, will do that magically for you. And this was made by a 10-year-old with the app, and this is just a fun one. These are Conway tiles. And so here's some websites that you can go to. The Conway's Magical Pen is the where you'll find the app. From that site, if you wish, you can also download a PDF of my 1980 article about the Conway criterion, which gives full proof of this. And there's also a presentation that was made last October by myself. It's up on YouTube for the Celebration of Mind, and that gives also details about these 2 geometric gems. So Conway was a genius in many ways, and he left us these 2 geometric gems. Thank you.
Next, we have Derek Smith to say a few words. Derek is the co-author with John of Quaternions, the book Quaternions and Octonions. And if you're ready, Derek.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. This is my first G4G. I'm very happy to be here. I was a student of John's. And thanks to the organizers for giving me a chance to say just a few words about John and to all the tribute speakers that are speaking about John and others we've lost. This is tough for me. He was a great teacher, mentor, co-author, and friend. Most importantly, a friend. And I miss him a lot. And too many lives have been lost recently. But I'd like to focus on just what a great teacher he was. You know this if you had the chance to interact with him here or anywhere else. I was having lunch today with someone that I just met, Jim Wilder, and he shared a story of after the first day of his first gathering, he went out to dinner and happened to hook up with John, and 3 hours later they were closing the restaurant down because John was just, going to town, and he was along for the ride. So many of you know this about him. I actually have proof. I was a TA for one of his classes, and a couple of weeks after the class ended, I think I went down to the offices and saw there was an envelope in his cubby, and I brought it down to him and said, "John, it looks like your student evaluations have come in." And he said, "Oh, I don't ever look at those." And so I put him down, and of course, if you put something down in John's office and then wait a week, you won't find it. So a little bit later, I said, "John, I'm going to open these," and he said, "Oh no, you can't do that." And he actually took off and left because he didn't want to hear what I had to say. And I think I tried to chase him down a little bit and might have said something, but John, wherever you are, they were great. The students really loved the class. So that's formal proof that he's a great teacher that we all know anyway. He taught me backgammon. We'd played a few times in the common room at Princeton during my first year there as a grad student, but then late in that first year, we were both there about 7 o'clock one night, and I don't think anyone else was left, and we sat down to play backgammon, and we didn't stop until dawn. So we played for about 10 hours straight, and by that time I was down 130 points, and but we just, we went at it and had a lot of fun, but he taught me so much about the game, and his patience was incredible. And so I remember him saying, kind of as we left, "Hey, you're better now than you were." And that was true. I was probably down 100 points by midnight, but it was a very memorable night for me. And the last anecdote I want to share, I think it's related to teaching too, is we were working together on some research, and it involved his book with Neil Sloan, the Sphere Packings, Lattices, and Groups. And we both needed a copy of some pages, and he had his copy, and I needed to make some copies of it. So I went to the copy room and put it down on the copier, and a bookmark fell out. And so I made the copies and I put the bookmark in. As I was putting it back in, I realized it was a $1,000 honorarium check for John that he'd evidently just stuffed in the book at some point. And I went down, I also read it said void after 180 days, and this was 3 years ago. So I went down and said, John, you have a check that you can't cash for $1,000. And he said, oh, yeah, that would have been useful at the time. And then we went on and did work. It took about 5 seconds for him to get over that. And so I just imagined that what had happened is he'd gone somewhere to give a talk and to teach people, and then he'd gotten a check, and he stuffed it in a book, and he got back, and before he could cash it, he started teaching people again, and there he was teaching me, and so he taught me that teaching and math were more important than money. He taught me many other things, and I've got a good story about cohomology and John, if you are interested. Catch me at some point over the next couple of days. But that's all I really have to say. I miss him a lot, and thanks for the opportunity to share a few anecdotes.
Thank you, Derek. Next up, Neil Calkin. Are you ready? Yes, great. So Neil is going to share some memories of Richard Guy.
Also like to second what Derek just said about John Conway. I was an undergraduate in his classes, and he had the most amazing... Sorry? Better? Okay. I was an undergraduate in some of John Conway's classes at Cambridge, and he had the most amazing ability to explain things at just the right level so that you would get almost viscerally what he was talking about. And he could do this with 5-year-olds, and he could do it with graduate students. The unfortunate thing was, it only lasted for about 30 minutes before you couldn't remember what it was his brilliance had shown you, because you couldn't see it through his lens. But I wanted to talk about Richard Guy today, the legacy of the notorious RKG. His impact on mathematics, on people and society, and some of the ways he made that impact. He was the author of over a dozen books, and I'm going to list just some of my favorites. First, it has to be UPINT, Unsolved Problems in Number Theory, an incredibly influential book on number theorists everywhere. I know so many number theorists who, in graduate school, encountered that book, found a problem to work on, found a direction for their mathematical research, as well as Unsolved Problems in Number Theory. Of course, he had Unsolved Problems in Geometry, Unsolved Problems in Combinatorial Games. That was with Richard Nowakowski. In Geometry was Hallard Croft and Kenneth Falconer. And I sort of sense a theme here, inspiring people with these problems. Of course, he was also the co-author with Berlekamp and Conway of Winning Ways for Your Mathematical Plays, which went from 2 volumes when I first bought a copy to 4 volumes when I bought the second edition. And a personal favorite, Book of Numbers. It's a beautifully written book. It shows the brilliance and style of both Richard and John. That's with Conway. And his last book came out, I think, shortly after his death, right around the time, in 2020, The Unity of Combinatorics with Bud Brown. And it is a lovely, eclectic look at some topics in combinatorics. It's not everything. And I'm not sure I agree with the title Unity, but it is an absolutely gorgeous book. He wrote over 300 papers, which is an incredible output, and over a third of them were in mathematics, including the Lester Ford-winning paper, The Strong Law of Small Numbers, which argues there aren't enough small numbers around to do the job. So when you see a pattern in small examples, it's probably not there. Too many people see patterns in small examples and don't take this seriously. He wasn't limited to mathematics. He wrote columns on chess problems, chess endings, for 4 or 5 years in the late 40s and early 50s. He was obsessed with chess, and he used to say perhaps that was why he never earned a PhD, because it kept him from getting a first as an undergraduate, and so he went on to other life. Another column, of course, was the research problems in the monthly, the American Mathematical Monthly, an incredibly influential column, again, introducing research problems to the research community. His impact on education was immense as well, both personal. For example, Gord Hamilton, who is not here in person, who has the website Math Pickle, it was inspired by Richard to introduce little kids, second grade and up, to problems that would make them think mathematically about various things. Richard helped start the US-Canada Math Camp, and was a participant in that first one. And one of the things that he did and inspired people with was he had a wonderful sense of play, which he didn't just bring out in himself, but he brought out in others. The sense of play exhibited itself in mathematics, but also in things like mountaineering and just in life in general. He was, of course, a mountaineer to the end. For his 100th birthday, he helicoptered up to the top of Mount Assiniboine Lodge, and hiked 4 miles to Wonder Pass, and then the next day hiked to the top of the Niblett, which is another peak in the area. And at the age of 102, picture this, 102, he participated in the Calgary Tower Climb, that's 802 steps, for a charity event for Alberta Wilderness Association. He cared very deeply about mathematical history, especially crediting forgotten people for their contributions. And many of you who've been at past gatherings will remember, perhaps for the first time, hearing about the amazing mathematician Pingala. I think I first heard about Pingala 6 or 8 years ago, whose discoveries predated similar work by the names we remember, like Fibonacci and Pascal. Incidentally, Pingala was what we would now call an applied mathematician, using combinatorial ideas to study poetry, my favorite form of applied mathematics. Richard was devoted to his wife Louise, a fellow climber and dancer, and they often traveled together. I don't know that I ever saw him without her while she was still alive, often traveling to conferences. Richard was, of course, small of stature, but huge in influence. Every time I met him at a conference, he'd be wearing the same tweed jacket, Same big button on his jacket proclaiming, "Peace is a disarming concept." I always thought his twinkling smile was a permanently disarming concept too. He was an international globetrotter. He loved traveling the world. He spent World War II as a military meteorologist in Iceland, subsequently taking academic appointments in Singapore and in India, finally arriving in Calgary in 1965, where he spent the rest of his working career. He lived and worked, or was paid to work, until he retired in 1982. And then, of course, he continued to work unpaid and continued to go to his office, typically 5 days a week, until his death in 2020. So that's almost 40 years after his retirement. He was going 5 days a week to his office unpaid. One example of his influence, during his time in India, he inspired Divakar Bhargava, who would relate stories of this English mathematician to his nephew, Manjul. Manjul, of course, is now a passable mathematician himself in some fields. Manjul Bhargava, of course, subsequently became very close friends with Richard, and they would have long conversations whenever they met. I think the last time I saw them meet was here 2 years ago. 4 years ago. Richard collaborated a lot. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one of his earlier collaborations was with Erdos, another great collaborator. They met in 1960 in Singapore. And this meeting led Richard to regard himself as potentially a research mathematician. He had played with research before with Cedric Smith and others in doing some things in game theory, but he answered some of Erdős's questions. They ended up writing 4 papers together, and Richard seriously became a serious research mathematician. Others with whom he worked are a list of mathematical luminaries. You only need the last names for them: Berlekamp, Bollebash, Conway, Gardner, Knuth, Selfridge, Sloan. His notable works include co-creating combinatorial game theory and much of its foundations, and contributing greatly to its development, especially with his student Richard Nowakowski and his students. Discovering the glider in the early days of the game of life. The glider was amazing because what it did is it enabled long-range communication. And it was that long-range communication at a distance, that made possible the proof that life is Turing complete. This, of course, led to his close friendship and close collaboration with Conway. Richard was known for asking the right questions, organizing collections of his and other people's questions, and asking the right questions of the right people, including, of course, in 1940, asking a question of his bride-to-be, Louise. Everyone who knew them knew she found the right answer to that question. He brought serious attention to recreational mathematics, in particular through things like his enthusiastic participation in G4G. Richard is one of the reasons we can take recreational mathematics seriously now. We can do recreational mathematics and expect other people to take it seriously. His sense of play carried over to other realms, especially to words. He loved cryptic crosswords and probably would have liked the cryptic clue making the rounds in 2020. Carnivorous bats, cause of pandemic, 11 letters. It's an anagram, and it's, of course, an anagram of coronavirus. He said that he never earned a PhD. In 1991, the University of Calgary awarded him an honorary doctorate, and Richard said that they gave him the degree out of embarrassment. On the contrary, the University of Calgary said that his extensive research efforts and prolific writings in the field of number theory and combinatorics have added much to the underpinnings of game theory and its extensive applications to many forms of human activity. Richard never earned a PhD? University of Calgary begs to differ. In conclusion, Richard was, in essence, a man of problems. Many beautiful, delightful problems, and we are lucky that he shared so many of them with us. Richard, we'll miss you.
So Joe Buhler is going to say a few words about Richard as well.
Richard was really a striking character in many ways. I remember talking to him about any number of different things. One was mountaineering. I was in the lobby of MSRI, and I'm talking to Richard and Louise, and I said, how do you tell elevation? And he said, well, pops out his watch and says that MSRI is an elevation of 1,100 feet. He, of course, had that crinkly smile. I don't think I can compete with Neil in describing all of the ways that Richard was unusual. But he was a real delight to talk to and a lot of fun. So I'll say one more thing. I remember inviting him to give a talk and to undergraduates, which he gave, and he must have been around 90 then, and it was on elliptic curves. Richard would find elliptic curves wherever he could. And so, I let him sit in my office for the afternoon to kind of warm up for the talk. I come back in, and he's sound asleep, kind of napping, seemed reasonable to me, but his notebook was open. And I gently woke him up, and he was sitting there, and he was compiling lists of points on an elliptic curve. And I thought that was just amazing, both because of the willingness to do straight old numerical work and just sit there and be happy doing that. I got to talking to him about elliptic curves, and one of the next things he said surprised me quite a bit too. And when I said, well, what should we be teaching number theorists nowadays? And he said, elliptic curves, and you really have to focus on the abstract stuff. I wasn't able to learn algebraic curves, schemes, etc., but that's what you have to do. And that was a very vivid striking of his mathematical sense. So anyway, Richard was a very fun person to talk to whenever you got the chance.
Thank you, Joe, and I apologize for surprising you like that. We'll hear from Joe again in a few minutes. Next up, we have a tribute to Ron Graham, pre-recorded by Steve Butler.
Thanks for giving me a few minutes to talk about Ron Graham. Ron was an amazing mathematician, a great performer, and someone with an uncanny ability to connect with audiences. And he used this to help really bring more math to more people and get them excited about math and interested in doing math. I want to share a few things about Ron, some things you may know, and maybe one or two you might not. Many people associate Ron with juggling, and for good reason. He was himself a very good juggler, and of course there's lots of photos of Ron juggling. Some of his favorite photos are of Ron juggling. There's a photo that has Ron juggling, and if you count, 12 balls, which is amazing, especially considering that the record was about 10 or 11 when that picture came out. Well, on a side note, Ron's daughter, Shay, is one of the world's best Photoshop people. If there's a celebrity who needs to look 10 pounds lighter or 5 years younger, they call Shay. But Ron, how did he get interested in juggling? Well, when he was around 15, he went to the University of Chicago for a very special program, and he got involved in many things: gymnastics, acrobatics, trampolining, and juggling as well. And he learned to juggle, and he got good at it, and it became sort of a lifelong passion. At one point in time, he was the president of the International Jugglers Association, and he would also teach many other people to juggle. So sometimes after he would go and give a math talk, he would take people and show them how to juggle. And another person was a juggler named Steve Mills, who as a teenager in New Jersey, Ron taught at the YMCA, taught Steve how to juggle. Now Steve Mills went on and made his career out of juggling, and created a pattern called Mills Mess, very famous juggling pattern. And in some sense, if there was no Ron, well, there wouldn't be any Mills Mess, wouldn't exist. So he has certainly left a big impact on the juggling community. And a very large number of people either learn directly from Ron or learn from someone who learned from Ron. And so that's Now, you could say that Ron was definitely a performer in spirit, and he did this. So during his math talks, he would sometimes juggle. Sometimes he would have one-armed handstand to demonstrate ideas. And of course, he really put a lot of thought and effort into his talks. It wasn't that unusual for people to remember a talk he gave, 40 or 50 years later, because there was something magical about his talks. One time, he was giving a talk this was back in the day, when they used document camera overhead projectors. And they would have two of them set up, spaced apart from each other. And you'd go back and forth and present slides. And Ron was in the middle of the talk and doing the slides on one screen, moved across the other, and started, and he said, just like what's over there. And he pointed to the other screen. And there was a hand there. You're like, what? How is his hand there? Well, he had put a fake hand and had used that to help point to the screen. Oh, okay, that's just one example. Ron was an amazing research mathematician. If you look at his career, he had about 400 papers published in mathematics on lots of different subjects. So early days, very much focused on number theory, transformed into Ramsey theory, but there were also practical applications as well. So a few of the things that he's known for, of course, probably most well known for is Ramsey theory, which you could sum up as saying that complete disorder is impossible. There's always some small pocket of order. And one of the things that's tied to this is Graham's number, which is the largest number. At one point in time, it was in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest number used in a mathematical proof. And it's so large that they needed new notation to come up with it. Now, if you look for Graham's number in his papers, he actually never published a paper with Graham's number, but it's popularized by Gardner, who helped bring it out to the world. Now you might say, well, what's the goal of Graham's number? Now, if you ask his daughter, Shay, his goal was he wanted to have the biggest number. Well, all right, great, success. But also it's a bound. It's a bound for a particular problem. And it says, by the time you get this number, then definitely something is true. Well, what's the right answer? We don't know. What might it be? Well, it could be as low as 13. So somewhere between 13 and the biggest number ever constructed is the answer. Well, someday, maybe we'll know. Maybe. Now, of course, there's other things that Ron did. And one of the things he worked on is problems with a very geometrical flavor. So one of his things he did was the largest small hexagon, which is to say, all right, among all the hexagons of unit diameter, so no 2 points are more than distance one apart, which one has the largest area? Now, intuition might say, oh, the regular hexagon. No. It turns out you can do slightly better. And Ron was able to figure out the exact area of the best one. Of course, this particular hexagon turned out to be fairly popular. A mathematical friend of his, Joel Spencer, used that particular hexagon to make a little sandbox for his kids. Another person later learned about it and wrote to him, said, I'd like to use this to design memorial plots and actually send a very detailed thing. Well, you never know. Another thing Ron was very much involved in was mathematics and magic. And a lot of this with his good friend and colleague, Percy Diaconis. And they wrote a wonderful book, Magical Mathematics, with a foreword written by Martin Gardner. And they really say, look, here's some very interesting mathematics that can be demonstrated with some simple cards. And they wrote a paper about mathematics of perfect shuffling, which, I always kind of wish they wrote more papers. Because in their first paper, they said, well, there's about 100 people in the world who can do 8 perfect shuffles in under 1 minute. All right. Then in their second paper, they're like, well, there's like 1,000 people in the world who can do 8 perfect shuffles in under a minute. And I thought, wow, that's exponential growth. they just wrote another 7 or 8 papers, everybody in the world would be able to do 8 perfect shuffles. Well, maybe. Of course, there's also mathematics of juggling. There are several papers on that, and was very instrumental in really popularizing side swap and bringing that to the mathematical community. And on the other hand, for his job at Bell Labs, he worked at Bell Labs. They wanted him to solve problems, and one of the interesting problems there is something called Steiner trees, which is we want to minimize the amount of material that we need, for example, to connect some cities via telecommunication lines. Well, of course, this is a mathematical problem. And fun fact, turns out Martin Gardner did write a math paper. He didn't just write about mathematics, he actually wrote mathematics. And it was a paper written with Ron Graham and Van Chung. And it was on a problem about Steiner trees. So all sorts of beautiful mathematics that's out there. Ron definitely had a very playful side to his personality. Once when Ron went to visit some people over in India, and he was showing them spinning on a plate, and they were showing, look, I can do that too. And Ron just casually mentioned, oh, wow, that's good. But the really good ones, good people can actually take a TV guide and spin that. And wow. And so then, about a year later, Mom went back and was visiting, and they said, look, we worked on it and we mastered it. We can now spin a TV guide. And I was like, what? No, I was just kidding. Nobody can do that. Well, that's the advantage of if you don't know something is impossible, or even if you just think it's possible, you might actually succeed. Well, that's sort of the way that Ron liked to think about things. Ron became sort of a central hub of information. He had this wonderful way of constantly staying in connection with many, many people. Well, one of the things that helped to do was to help get the right problems to the right people, and the right people to the right opportunities. He became a mentor to many great mathematicians and helped shape a lot of what we know as discrete mathematics to this day. And of course, another thing that he was able to do was to help guide interesting ideas that could be nice to the general public towards people like Martin Gardner. And of course, Martin and Ron had a good relationship. Martin wrote the Introduction to Magical Mathematics, and in fact, he also wrote some very fictional stories that involved Ron at various points in time. And Ron, he came to some of the earlier Gathering for Gardners, and I remember one Gathering for Gardner that he came to where there was the world's strongest man was giving a demonstration and bending things, ripping telephones in half, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that he did was take a frying pan and roll it up. And Ron, right after the performance, raced from his seat to get it. So this is the actual frying pan. And one of the things is that Ron never kept anything. There's like almost no mementos from any conference he attended. But he kept this frying pan, and he made sure that he got it home. Because he loved these things. He loved the unusual, the strange. He loved to tell a good story and to share good stories with others. He was an amazing person, someone who I'll miss dearly, but I'm glad to have known him. And then you might say, well, will we ever have somebody like Ron Graham again? And I think Ron would probably say, maybe. But at least we had the one we did. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Steve. So now, Joe, would you be willing to come up and say a few words about Ron? Thank you.
Steve gave us a marvelous view of what Ron was like and some of the many impacts that he had. in many areas. If you start reflecting on those, you're really struck by the variety. At Bell Labs, Ron was instrumental in the emergence of computer science as a discipline, an academic discipline separate from mathematics and engineering. He was instrumental in the rise of combinatorics as a sophisticated and important mathematical field. He was critical in making Ramsey a very visible part of combinatorics. His role in finding mathematics in juggling or in magic or in lots of other things is, of course, notorious. His ability to be involved in the politics of supporting mathematics was really quite important at many junctures. This is all really striking, and all I really want to ask is the question of how was he able to do all of that? And I sort of think of three characteristics that he had. The first is very familiar to most everybody here. Ron had a very playful spirit. He loved the sense of play. Steve forgot to talk about trampolining or Rubik's Cube or many other things. Some of that play was physical play, table tennis, but a lot of it was very intellectual play. And that spirit was behind a lot of things that Ron did. The other was his social skills. Mathematicians aren't known for their social skills necessarily, but Ron really embodied those. He could start up a conversation in an elevator with just about anybody and have it end up in some interesting place. Finally, there's something I find a little harder to describe. It's sort of an intellectual intensity, sort of do the hard thing first. So if you were working on something with him, he would really force you not to be happy with what you'd done, but to go to the next problem and really dwell on that. He once, well, first of all, I should say, as far as Rubik's Cube goes, I sometimes get asked if I can solve any cubes bigger than 3 by 3. And I say I can prove that I can do it. I've never done it. Ron gave me, I think it was a birthday present, which was an 11 by 11 cube, and it had my initials on all 6 sides. And so that sounds okay, fine birthday present. But he was a subtle nudge that maybe I should start looking at 11 by 11 Rubik's Cubes. Somehow that intensity figured in everything he did, and all I can say is sometimes you saw it by virtue of him being an intellectual leader in some field, sometimes because he was just a catalyst, a totally outgoing catalyst of getting people to work on things, sometimes just being an enthusiast, being very supportive of whatever people were doing. However he did it, it was magical. I think we were all lucky to have known him, and I'm just really delighted to be able to describe all of that.
So this is obviously a very different character, so to speak, a different character of character, and so I will assume that most everybody knows who James Randi is, but probably most of you haven't met him. So, moving on. All right. So he left home, as it says there, when he was 17, just skipped school, stopped everything, joined a carnival. Now, I want to add that Martin Gardner has told me on more than one occasion that he's always regretted that he didn't run off with the carnival himself. So there was an instant binding force between those two people right there. And he was inspired by Blackstone to do a lot of stage magic. Now, he started a career as the Great Randall, and he I was hoping to be able to see my slides. I keep turning around. I apologize. And he started out doing close-up magic, as you might imagine. You don't start out as a stage magician. But mainly he started out as a mentalist, and because mentalism is actually a fairly easy thing to learn to do, and you do cold readings and you just tell people what they want to do. And he got kind of lucky And he found out, because people would stop him on the street, because he got a little bit of fame as a mentalist, they'd stop him on the street and ask him to help them run their lives. And he became deeply alarmed by this, and he gave up mentalism, okay, because he realized the harm that could be done with this power, with people believing in you to do that. So that was an important thing. The second thing in my short amount of time is that he was very much inspired by Houdini, not just in some way like mainly as a magician, as most magicians are, but of course magic, fine, but the other things that are more important is he was an escape artist. Of course, Houdini was an escape artist. Randi was an escape artist. He would spend most of his career as an escape artist, escaping from jails, suspended on a wire over Niagara Falls, getting out of straitjackets, doing milk can tricks and instant changes and so forth. So Randi made his career as an escape artist, and he was quite good at it. Now, the other thing that he shared with Houdini is that he was a showman. He made sure that he got publicity. He knew how to get out there. And again, in this way, he's the complete opposite of Martin Gardner, who was loath to leave his house. All right, and so that's in one way how they fed off each other. And he was also a debunker. Okay, and that's what most people know him of, if they know anything about him in this room. Now, he shared that with Houdini, and a lot of people don't know that Houdini spent the last 15 years of his life in a serious crusade against spiritualism, because he was very much alarmed by what spiritualists were doing, and that's another talk. But the point is that he got that inspiration to be a debunker from Houdini, and looking around, like he had already seen himself with, when people believe you, how things can go wrong. I was a little surprised putting this together that his $1,000 challenge started in 1964. I thought it was around 1970. So earlier than I thought, he was already publicly out there challenging people who were making paranormal claims. And he kept upping this, and people started giving him money. And so eventually it got up to $1 million. Okay, so there was $1 million in the bank for anybody who could do anything paranormal under test conditions. Okay? Now again, this is a little bit of showmanship again, because he's trying to draw attention to this, and he knows how to get publicity. Over 1,000 claimants, nobody got close to claiming the $1 million. Okay? Now, some of the many things that he's done that have been reported on, one is Project Carlos, and as an example of how he worked, he took this person who didn't know anything, and he made him into a spiritual advisor. And he gave a press book, and he created the press book himself, and it was completely false. Everything was clearly false. It was from newspapers that didn't exist, all kinds of things. He was trying to show how people are easily fooled. That's what his goal was, not to fool people, but to show how they could be easily fooled. And the Popoff Ministries, of course, many of you might remember that. That's when the Popoff minister had an earpiece in his ear, and they recorded that. But Project Alpha is probably the best known thing he did, where he got several of his people to go into the laboratories like they had done 15 years earlier with Uri Geller in the SRI laboratories, people to go into the laboratories and test his proteges without telling them they were his proteges. And he told the people who were conducting the experiments how to prove they were frauds. He gave them the instructions on how to prove they were frauds, and they still didn't notice. Okay? So again, it's not so much he wants to fool people, he wants to show people how easily they are fooled. Okay, he was with Ray Hyman and Martin Gardner, the people who formed PsyCops, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims in the Paranormal. And I don't have time here to go over the history of PsyCop. It's all in my book, Dear Martin, Dear Marcello. But it was issue in that time whether they should be an educational foundation or whether they should be a debunking foundation. There's a lot of tension, even to this day, about whether you should be doing debunking or you should be doing education. He was for debunking. And after he got his MacArthur Genius Award, he started the James Randi Educational Foundation. So maybe he came over to the educational side. And now it focuses on grants. And I just leave you with two quotes. I can cheat you countless different ways, and you won't know, and you won't catch me. And the other is, you can be deceived. That was his big message to everybody. You can be deceived. You don't have to wander into things thinking you figured it out. Get a magician to help you, thank you very much, because if you don't have a magician helping you, you will be deceived. Okay, thank you.
And finally, we have Jim Gardner, also for some memories.
So, growing up with Dad, I suspect that, or at least I like to think, that famous scientists, Nobel laureates, and other people came to the house. And at various stages, I probably had zero idea of who that person was, with one exception, and that was the celebrity James Randi. And I'll start off just a couple photos of all the people that Dad knew. Randi was what I considered his best friend. And my thoughts are that Randi also considered that Dad was his best friend. So there are a couple wonderful photos of Randi on the web. This is one of them. This is another one with Ted Nye, the science guy. Likely the two of them, again, two celebrities who pushed critical thinking, who were skeptics and wanted to get the public to understand that there were a lot of things in life that Randi called flim-flam, stuff that was made to deceive us, to try to get money, and Randi certainly was a champion of trying to get the public to understand that you needed to be a critical thinker, that things were not always as they appeared. Being a 7 or 8 year old growing up, one of the most exciting things was getting to stay up late at night and watch Johnny Carson, which was East Coast time. That was 11:30. But the wonderful thing was, of the times when I was very young to get up to see Carson, it was always when Randi was going to be appearing on the Johnny Carson show. And Randi had, I don't know the number, but over the course of his life, 20, 30 different appearances, because Carson was also a magician. And Carson, in addition, was anti-flim-flam, or whatever. So, for example, one of the times that I remember Dad talking vividly about something that was presented on Carson that was very exciting was when Uri Geller was set to appear. And if you remember, Uri Geller was the fellow who was bending spoons and objects with his mind. Well, Geller was set to appear, but unbeknownst to him, Carson had Randi come in to set up certain prior conditions for when Geller was going to appear. And as Dad described it, there was a table where the spoons and items that Geller was going to bend with his mind or do other feats, but in front was a strong-armed security man, and Geller was not allowed, prior to appearing on stage, to touch any of those items. And thus, when Geller went on Carson, with the help of Randi, Geller was unable to perform any of his mind-bending acts because he wasn't able to get to the objects ahead of time to gaff them and affect other things. I'm going to ask you to bear with me. And I would like to channel Dad for one point. And in Undiluted Hocus Pocus, Dad makes the following comments about James Randi. No one, and that should be in, that's a typo I just noticed. No one in the world is more skillful than Randi in devising ways to trap swindlers and self-deluded parapsychologists. Randi knows more about science than some scientists I have met. Scientists untrained in the conjuring arts of deception are the easiest people in the world to fool. That's why Randi, a magician, is so much more capable of detecting fraud than any scientist, including especially parapsychologists. He knows how, as few scientists do, all the best way to set traps for catching psychic swindlers. If you want to know how Geller bends spoons, don't ask the physicist. Even if he won a Nobel Prize, ask me or Randi. And so I found in closing just a couple other slides. Here's one from one of the early gathering for gardeners. You may recognize some of the other people in that photo. And then of the many times that Randi would come visit, and once again, I knew ahead of time when Randi was coming because he was always the person I wanted to meet when he was visiting Dad in informal settings. Here's a nice photo of Dad and Randi when Dad had moved out to live in Norman. At the Amazing Meeting in Amazing Meeting 13, after Dad died, Randi was very wonderful in providing a session honoring Dad. But what I really enjoyed about that meeting, and I don't have it, was everyone who attended got a bent spoon that was attached to that. And as he says, I attest that that spoon was not bent by psychic means. And then I think Randi even went and signed it individually. So Randi certainly loved to poke fun at psychics and certainly let them know. At one point, Randi, I think, worked very closely with Percy Diaconis early on. There was a fellow, Ted Sirios, who claimed he could put a Polaroid camera up to his head and take photos of his thoughts. And Randi and Percy were directly involved with exposing Sirios. One time Randi came out to visit Dad. We had dinner. There's Randi, of course, always the center of attention. He was never one to mince words and certainly loved to share his thoughts and stories with other people. Jamie Ian Swiss was his guest and came out. So there's a great photo of them. And then the final photo of the two of them is the three in Dad's room, and back behind them, it's not a good shot, but is a 5-shelf bookcase that contained nothing but copies of Dad's books. So in closing, in a lot of ways, I think the collaboration between Dad, Randi was the front person, and Dad was the person who Randi almost always consulted before he did something, and or kept Dad in the queue of information. I don't know how many times when I would visit Dad and walk in, if Dad was talking to someone, he would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, my son just walked in, so I'm going to have to cut this off." But if it was Randi, it was, I'm talking to Randy, and the two of them talked probably over the course of 20 years, I think, on an average, on a weekly basis. So Randy certainly was a central person in the life of Dad, just as I like to say Dad was a central person in the life of Randy. So thank you very much.